Hello, 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 everyone. Happy Friday. We're back for another week of live plant consciousness commentary. If you're new around here, I am Tigria Gardenia, and it is always, always a pleasure to be here with you. Can you believe it's Friday? Friday. It's been an interesting week, to say the least. But I'm extremely excited, since we are in the naturally conscious community, to tell you all that, no, I'm going to keep it a secret. I have to keep it a secret a little bit longer, but I promise I have some interesting, good news that will protect us and keep us sprouts all united and together here for a long time to come. All right. We're going to be talking again about invasive species. This has kind of been the week of invasive species, and this paper is a little bit different than even what I thought it was based on the title. So I'm really looking forward to going through it with you. I have to admit, I have not read anything other than maybe like 3 sentences from the abstract at all, because as always, I like to watch and read everything here with you. But this really kind of is a continuation of what we talked about on Tuesday's plant-inspired masterclass. So as we know, we have our plant-inspired masterclass inside of Blooming Sprouts once a month. And there we go. It's kind of continuing education from Reconnect to the Plant with the Plant Kingdom, and from a lot of the topics that come up. It's our opportunity to kind of take a little sliver of a piece, go deep into it, and then look at how we apply it to our regular life and our everyday actions. I mean, as you know, everything that we do here in the Naturally Conscious community is about not just learning about plants, not just about seeing plants as models, which all of it is true, but really about that collaborative and that integrative perspective as well. The idea of how do we step deeper into our own plantness and bring that out into the things that we do on day-to-day life. And all of this really helps us understand who we are, how to step deeper into different logics, the whole idea of how do I embrace my weird and my woo. There's just so many changes that happen as a consequence of this. And invasive species is a big topic. I mean, especially right now with everything that's happening in the world. There are so many places where the idea of looking at how nature approaches the concept of an invasive species, of being naturalized, can be applied on a global stage. And then from there, bringing it down and deep into our personal lives and the ecosystems that touch us on a regular basis. So I think that's why I'm excited about talking about this. I know this is going to be very macro in some aspects. It's going to be talking about certain plants and really going into it. So hopefully together we can look and see what are the parallels, what are the conversation pieces, what are the ways that we can approach this in our own lives and connect into it. And I'm really glad that you're here to take this journey with us. So wherever it is that you're watching from, thank you. Thank you for being here. And if you're watching this on a replay or on a restream, thank you again for being a part of everything that we do here in the Naturally Conscious community and of participating. And I'm looking forward to hearing your comments. Okay. Without further ado, I'm just going to share the title, like share this paper so that we can really get into it, because I feel like there is a lot to cover here. And and I don't want us to kind of drag on with time. So we've got lots to cover here. This is a paper that came out. This is a little bit of an older paper. You know how I always kind of start talking about the dates. The dates are important. The dates are really important for where we are right now. Okay, remember, if we're talking about an extremely established discipline, then dates really don't matter, whether something came out 10 years ago or 3 years ago or maybe even 15 years ago. But in the context of everything relating to plant humanities, plant critical plant studies, everything connected to plant intelligence, plant consciousness, these are extremely important in the dates for us to be able to understand the timeline of when certain things went from being almost unheard of to introduced and contested to, wait a minute, maybe this is actually true after all, or something we can agree upon. And in some cases to things that, oh yeah, okay, we can all agree upon that now. Because if we read them without taking into consideration the timeline, we might not understand where the thinking is. So this is a 2015 paper. So 2015 paper, relatively young in the perspective of some of these topics. By this point, the conversation around plant neurobiology, around plant consciousness has taken hold. We are still in an argumentative phase, but there is a lot of new pieces around the plant humanities that are starting to be born. And especially invasive species took on a sort of life of their own in many ways, because a lot of the concepts around these topics. So when we came from the biological perspective of plant intelligence, plant neurobiology, that came from the European, United States sort of realm. There was a lot more work on that perspective. A lot of the aspects around plant cognition, plant humanities came from the Australian realm. That's where Monica Galliano is set, where Prudence Gibson is, where many of the other voices that are coming through. That's not to say that there's not overlap all over the place. I'm not saying that they're isolated there, but I'm just saying that if you're thinking about invasive species, Australia is a place that thinks about this topic a lot from many different perspectives. From the perspective specifically around the plants, we have an ecosystem that had a fairly unique flora for many, many, many years, many species that can only be found in Australia. And then with colonization and subsequent also migration of people have created, has really damaged the landscape from the perspective of looking at the native species that were always there. So Australia gave us the opportunity to see many, many species that have only been there and that arrived into Australia on their own or grew up or evolved from those lands. And then with colonization, which has its own invasiveness around it, and also, brought also many explorations of plants and many invasive species that came in. So when you're looking at the topic of invasive species, it's not uncommon to see Australian authors or Australian researchers or research that happens in Australia being at the forefront of this conversation. And I find this to be extremely interesting, but also given the fact that so many of the parallels of plants as models and mentors has come from Australia as well, I think it's really fascinating how that this topic, which is in some ways such a human topic in so many other areas of life, I feel like it's so interesting how these two things have kind of crossed paths in this particular place. So that being said, this is actually, this is actually coming from Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers. So this is actually a geography paper, and it's really been interesting for me to discover the entire ecogeography movement. I did not have a lot of knowledge into ecogeography before I sort of explored many of these types of papers. And so really kind of thinking about the world from a geographic perspective and how the geography then applies to many of the other applications and many other conversation points we talk has been, rather a learning curve, and in a very pleasant way for that. Okay, so this is coming out of Australian Centre for Cultural and Environmental Research, the University of Wollongong, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Australia, and the Centre for Critical and Cultural Studies from the University of Queensland. So all of this Australian-wise, like I said, because the invasive species is a topic that is kind of in the forefront for all those different reasons that I just mentioned. Okay, so first line. You already have to take a deep breath with this first line. The lower status of plants relative to animals, one of the defining characteristics of Western thoughts. At least they spelled it out. I mean, they just said it straight up, said it, which it is true, but nobody says it like that. So kudos to you for saying it. Is under challenge from diverse research in botany, philosophy, and the more than human social sciences, including geography. See, remember, I told you context of dates is important. 2015, already the more than human social sciences is growing in awareness. That's not to say that it didn't ever exist. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to say it's grow at this point has a much, much broader awareness than if they would have tried to write something of this type. You wouldn't have seen it in the early 2000s or Yeah, you just wouldn't have seen it. Although the agency of plants is increasingly demonstrated, scholars have yet to fully respond for plants to Loca's call to attend more carefully to the details of non-human difference. Curious. This paper advances the concept of shared capacities of plants in order to take them seriously in their own terms. I'm sorry, I keep pausing because these words, like, in order to take them seriously in their own terms, because prior to this paper, we didn't take them seriously in their own terms. I'm hoping that they explain what they mean here. And to consider what that means for human-plant relations more generally. We identify 4 capacities illustrated through plant lives: distinctive materialities, moving independent of humans, sensing and communicating, and taking shape as flexible bodies. I hope that by moving independent of humans, they're talking about in the idea of a human like digging a plant up and moving, but not necessarily all the other things that plants themselves have evolved into doing in order to move with humans, such as, seeds being eaten, such as things getting stuck to our clothing, other options that are not specifically human picking up and moving a plant. But I guess we'll find out. Let's see. Taking shape as well. Together, these provide a sense of plant worlds in which distinct but highly variable plant forms have their own lives, interacting with humans and others in contingent ways. As empirical illustration, we explore the adversarial relationship between rubber vine, Cryptotengia grandiflora, it's almost like a crypto thing, Cryptostengia grandiflora, I love these names, and invasive plant managers in Northern Australia. Ooh, who are the invasive plant managers? In this case, biosecurity strategies, just the fact that there is something called biosecurity is such a beautiful thing. In this case, biosecurity strategies are affected by and affecting the rubber vine, assembling plants as individuals and collectives, feral and stock animals, fire and helicopters, human skills, and legislation. Recognition of plant capacities challenges us to rethink several concepts often framed against a human norm, including agency, subjectivity, and the ethics of killing. All right, this is already going to get good. Okay, where are we? Plants and, oops, oh, please don't do that to me. Plants and humans are influential co-producers of the biosphere, and their mutual futures depend on collaborations and conflicts of many kinds, not least in the significant land management issues of invasive species control. The need for diverse scholarship on our relationships with plants has never been greater, but we are hampered by an entrenched intellectual heritage. That's a line for you to just remember. Hampered by an entrenched intellectual heritage, which is another way of saying we're blocked by our conditioning. The difference between animals and plants and the lower status of the latter has been one of the defining characteristics of Western thought since Aristotle defined animals as those who move and plants as those who do not. Aristotle's Scala Naturae. That heritage is being challenged in various disciplines, and a body of botanical and philosophical research now makes the case for plants to be engaged with as subjects rather than objects. Geography is an important place to extend these conversations because of its heritage of approaching human-plant relations from various perspectives. This paper conceptualizes the distinct capacities of plants with the aim of advancing understanding within more than human geography and extending conversations between human geography and biogeography. Engaging with human geography, we start from Lulka's argument that there is a residual humanism in the use of the hybridity, big words, hybridity concept when non-humans are lumped as a singular entity. Agreed. Hence why I do not like the term non-humans. Like, really? Non-humans? Then again, we lump humans all in together, and we know that that's not the case, that they're not all the same. He called for a thick hybridity in which an adequate sense of difference is maintained, while more, oh, hold on a second, sorry. I have to fix my screen. This is making it very hard to read. Okay. While more than human geographies has demonstrated the agency of plants in contexts that include trees, gardens, invasion, crops, and seeds, where there has been insufficient attention in this literature to the category plants. We draw on new research involving scientific sensing to conceptualize plant capacities, the shared capacities of one group of beings called plants, and the differences they bring to relations with humans and others. Okay. Oops, sorry. I'm trying to look at how this paper is organized. Sorry, on my screen, it's very weird in how it does this. We understand plant capacities as relational achievements, the relations in question enacted with the sun, water, and soil, and also often with humans and other animals and other plants. These are contingent relationships in which categories and forms should not be reified, even though they may congeal and be stabilized for long periods of time. From biography and ecology, we draw particular attention to recent concepts of anthropocentric biomes, or anthromes. Anthromes, nice word. And novel ecosystems that, in contrast to mainstream biogeographic approaches, have explicitly brought the human into the system under consideration. The profound transformations and future uncertainties in the landscape of the Anthropocene require such considerations, but much of the relevant action is happening at a more local scales than, for example, seen in anthromes. So anthromes, anthropogenic biomes. The issue of invasive plant management is a signature challenge of the Anthropocene. Issue of invasive, I would have never thought about that like that. And one to which both human geography and biogeography are making important contributions. In this paper, we develop a particular case of rubber vine, managed as an invasive species in Northern Australia. Presenting a new empirical study on rubber vine management, we show how the distinctive capacities of plants are expressed in particular ways in rubber vine and its relations with humans, animals, and a host of others. Our ethnographic focus on the practice of an adversarial relationship provides new perspective on such relations. As Lorimer has argued, most work in the more than human geographies has tended towards affirmative relations and has yet to focus on examples in which the interested parties, human and non-human, are engaged in lethal and antagonistic relations. Okay, I find this really synchronic. I was listening to a presentation by Giovanni Aloi, who we've talked about briefly. We haven't actually really gotten into most of Aloi's work because Aloi's work is very verbose and it would take us a long time to go through it. That doesn't mean we're not going to. I'm just kind of like looking at the best way for us to do this. And Michael Martyr, who we've talked about multiple times as the philosopher in the area of critical plant studies and a very big advocate as to plant subjectivity and plant awareness. The interesting part that was coming up in this talk and this conversation that they were having that I found fascinating was the fact of in this case is not really talking specifically about this, but I do want to emphasize this because I think it's really interesting, which is that there is a tendency from the kind of, okay, permit me for a second for putting it into these terms, but I'm only using this to help us distinguish certain parties, not that I think that this is the best terminology to use. There is, of course, a whole kind of area of plant lovers, let's use that way, plant lovers that come from a kind of spiritual kumbaya, plants are amazing, herbalism and other things, which, mind you, I love. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not thinking anything bad about any of you. Love you, love you, love you. At the same time, Martyr and Aloi were having a conversation about this because they said, we tend to forget that plants have this whole other side. I mean, they're not always so nice. Like, we can't go into the idea of critical plant studies or of plants consciousness or plant awareness thinking that plants are always 100% altruistic and always looking at things beauty. And we have talked about this. We talk about this in Reconnect with the Plant Kingdom. We talked about this recently in I Am Plants. We talk about the fact that plants are sometimes parasites. They are sometimes predators. They are sometimes taking over other spaces as invasive species, or even as, to a certain extent, colonizers of an area, both in its positive as well as sometimes negative connotations. And we have to start looking at plants as persons, and as persons, that means looking at all of the behaviors and accepting and understanding that plants are beings with an entire landscape of different ways that they act. And sometimes those acts are selfish. And selfish, here's where I think we're going to start getting into a really interesting piece of conversation that's not for today, but I'm going to throw it out there. I'm going to kind of plant this seed a little bit. Is, when is selfishness positive, and when does selfishness become egotism? I'm going to plant that seed. Just leave it there. We'll water it, we'll nurture it. We'll start to see what comes up, and we'll bring it back into the forefront in another conversation. But this is, I think, a really important aspect of us understanding ourselves, our humanness through our plantness, by really playing into this idea that plants do exhibit selfish type of behavior sometimes, right? To be able to survive in certain environments. But where is there an egoism involved in that? And if not, how can we as humans understand the type of selfishness that is, how can we learn from that type of selfishness? How can we create that type of selfishness that is healthy, nourishing, and still building out an ecosystem, versus egotism, which we tend to look as a destructive nature, even though selfishness will have destructive pieces to it? Or are we just miscalculating plants and we're not recognizing the fact that plants also can be egotistical? And what does that mean? So again, planting a seed, just leave it there in a corner. We're not going to talk about it right now, but this was a fascinating conversation, and something that they just sort of threw it out there the same way. I don't think any of us have really kind of dug into it really well. Okay. Here we are. We're over here. Jin has recently used the concept of detachment in considering gardener-slug relationships in British gardens. And with slugs, many human interactions with plants involve the death of the latter, thus invoking questions of ethics and responsibility, whether towards individuals, species, or landscapes. The policy rhetoric of invasive species plant management is very much about human control. Let's emphasize that phrase. I'm going to say it again. The policy rhetoric of invasive plant management is very much about human control. So agree, and why sometimes these conversations are so difficult, because humans like to be in control. However, the experience is often rather different on the ground, where no practitioner doubts the agency of plants. We understand questions of ontology and biopolitics as a deeply empirical affair, emergent from contingent relations. As such, we explore one attempt to manage or live without plants. Rubber vine biosecurity in Northern Australia. Questions of how our conceptualization of plant capacities, sorry, I'm covering my own screen. Questions on how our conceptualizations of plant capacities might manifest in other spaces and times remains critical, but open. The case included in this paper demonstrates how the capacities of plants enacted by rubber vine in relation with other plants, including humans, animals, helicopter, fire, and legislation, challenge us to rethink how agency and subjectivity are conceptualized. Ooh, now I am totally invested in this. Plant subjects in human geography. Human geographers and others have contested the idea and practice of human exceptionalism and used this to rethink human and non-human identity and subjectivity. Feminist thought has been an important part of this challenge to the constitution of the autonomous, rational Cartesian subject. If the human cannot be privileged in ways long assumed, there are many challenging discussions to be had around how we develop more ethical relationships with animals, bacteria, and the indifferent earth itself. I'm sorry, I'm pausing at the word indifference because for the last 2 weeks, I have been having very intense conversations on the word indifferent. Indifferent is a word that in Dublin culture is used a lot, specifically the Italian version of the word indifferente. And the reason is because indifference is a form of non-attachment, but it also has a wider context to it from a Damanhurian philosophy perspective. It is an extremely important part of our spiritual development to step into, to recognize, to embody indifference. The idea that I take an action because the action is the best to take, and I am indifferent of all of these other pieces around it. It's a much more complex situation. I'm not going to get into right now. I mean, I was just having one of the classes that I teach, one of the groups of Method Action that I co-lead with another person. We got into a big discussion around indifference because it is such an important topic that is more in a Damanhurian philosophy than just non-attachment. Non-attachment is great. The idea that I'm not attached to the response. But indifference is not aloofness or not caring. Indifference is, on the contrary, is very much caring, but being indifferent to the easiest way I could say it right now is to the external pulls that are not specific or pertain to the actual conversation. Therefore, my choices can be made in a very clean way. And I think that that's what they were talking about, the indifferent earth itself, which, by the way, I would still say earth should be capital E, because that is earth as in the planet, the being, not earth as in a little bit of earth on the ground, at least I think. And so earth is indifferent to the sense that earth is really looking at everything that is context inside of the context and not being pulled by other strings that are not part of whatever decision needs to be made. Not sure if that's clear, but this is why we have things like our plant-inspired masterclasses, and why we have our, blooming sprouts and flourishing sprouts and places where we can have these big conversations, because none of these conversations are easy and 1 second to take. Lori says, I used indifference in a discussion about non-attachment and spirituality the other night and was taken to task. So we should talk more deeply about this sometime. I didn't argue with them. Exactly. Indifference gets made to think that it's about not caring, and that is not the crux of indifference. And the question is whether or not this is a lost in translation. Is indifference not the same word or the right word in an English vocabulary? Or is this, again, another case of the connotation and the widely understood definition of indifference not really fitting into what the core essence of the word should be, and therefore we should reclaim the word, because reclaiming the word also reclaims those actions and allows us to sort of get out of this idea of not caring, but instead into something different. So Lori, I agree. I think this is a great topic for one of our future group mentoring calls, where we start to talk about behavior and the way that we act based on this. Yeah, I'm with you. I am also a big proponent of reclaiming the word. So let's work together to come up with some new definitions and some new descriptions that we can include in there. Okay, notwithstanding its rich heritage of ethnographic study of the ways human societies engage with the conceptualized plants, multi-species ethnography now attempts to recognize the plants themselves, along with other non-humans, as key players. Recognizing the value of such an approach with plants, Jones and Clock, would it be clock or cloak? Well, I guess it'll be one or the other. Argue that there is considerable scope for widening discussions of non-human agency to embrace beings or entities which are more markedly different than animals from the human. I think we're still talking about physical entities and beings, right? Gosh, okay, don't let me bring in non-worldly, non-corporeal, physical beings into this. Okay, let's stick to the biology. But know that in my mind, I'm already going into how does this apply when we're talking about nature spirits and others, but we're not going to go there. They examine trees to provide a detailed ground account of the non-human agency of particular beings, things, and materials. In doing so, they caution that a purely relational formulation of agency risks losing the analytic possibilities of understanding differences within networks. Purely relational formulation of agency risks losing the analytic possibilities of understanding differences within natures in the abilities and agencies of particular beings, things. Ugh, beings, things, being/things. Really, is that the way that we want to put this word? Anyway, for Jones and, again, I think it's Cloak, this meant the possible loss of the treeness of trees and therefore their specific agent possibilities. The failure to articulate non-human agency within its own ecological timescales, as well as in its own places, has made it difficult to grasp the notion of non-human agency with an extent and more anthropocentric view of agency. I can totally see that. I can totally see where they're coming from. There are connections here to herds, all these words, herds or herds. We're going to go with herds. We're going to go with herds, H-I-R-D''S. Yeah, herds. Argument that since bacteria sustain life on Earth through their production of key chemicals, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, carbon, and that because symbioses are obligate for animals but not bacteria, these species-defining organisms do proceed relating. In Heard's case, relationality seems to include only relations with humans. However, it is presumably possible to conceptualize bacteria or other non-humans as relational achievements without humans necessarily being involved. Oh, heaven forbid, no humans involved. A number of geographers have recently analyzed vernacular human experiences of agency of plants. Such experiences are characterized by people in both positive and negative terms. Plants display individual liveliness and beauty, exert calming influences, and draw patterns of care with people. On the other hand, plants have lives of their own beyond human control, which can lead to uneasiness and awkward encounters when plants are perhaps no longer often thought about in terms of their capacities and behaviors. For Jin, animals and plants are both active participants and subversive agents in the colonial landscape of, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Aotearoa. I know that the New Zealanders are going to kill me on this one. Aotearoa, New Zealand. The context in which Barker discusses contemporary agency and contemporary agency and changeability of gorse and its management. Barker argues that gorse itself has interjected in the way conceptual boundaries are constructed, for example, by acting as a nursery crop for native species. It may be that Australian practice has been somewhat ahead of social theory in its pragmatic engagement with exuberant life. Yet, as our empirical case shows, much Australian legislation and policy are distinctly less comfortable with such exuberance. Like Jones and Cloak, Lulka was keen to ask whether a purely relational hybridity has gone too far. There has been, it seems, considerable equivocation about the place of non-human corporeality in geographical writings that has yet to be fully resolved. He argued that there is currently no depth to the term non-human, and because there is no depth to the term, there is no way of conceiving that non-humans may act in hybrid ways, largely out of reach of society, and that have nothing to do with humans. Adding depth to how we conceive of plants and their relations in his close engagement with forest ethnography, Staden found that at virtually every turn, forest resources are not just objects of human intention and action, but also subjects in a much more fully dynamic and fascinating relationship. And indeed, the very language of subjects and objects began to break down. This is really complex. I mean, in a good way, it's bringing in a lot of pieces of thinking about plants Again, as agents, right, going back to that little, like that thing about indifference, right? When is a plant acting indifferently to the human? When is the plant instead coming in consciously, we'll throw that word in there for a second, into a human landscape? Or is it really the human that's acting indifferently and not recognizing itself inside of a plant landscape? I'm processing. This is why we watch these things together. We read them together in order for me to process out loud. You can see where my little wheels are turning. It's not an easy one to understand. It is notable that these independent non-human lives are always easier to imagine with animals than plants. So true, right? We can totally see that that little rabbit there doesn't care at all about what the human's doing, but it's hard to think that the grass is doing the same thing. Engaging deeply with beings such as plants is easier said than done. Most of us profoundly background plants. There are distinctive methodological challenges in accessing some of the more subtle aspects of plant agency. This is why plant communication is so important. I think everybody should be taught it. Everybody, especially if you're going to study any kind of science relating to landscape, ecology, environmental, botany, any of those types of things. However, there is a however here. Contradicting this approach is not difficult to accept that plants move, assess, evoke, grow, adjust, spread, use, limit, and resist as they are enacted their own worlds and ones shared with we humans. By conceptualizing the capacities of plants as we do, we hope to highlight some of the possibilities and stimulate further conversations about how to consider plants more fully. Following Haraway's advice of staying with the trouble, we need to spend more time with plants, differentiating the non-human and deepening our studies of them. Hallelujah. Isn't that beautiful? That's a beautiful line. That is so true. We need, if we are going to understand how to create harmonic, equitable relationships with plants, where we are going to start to move away from a status of control and into a status of collaboration, we need to be having these conversations. We need to be going deeper into these relationships. The human in biogeography. If human geographies have been rather slow to specifically consider plants, within biogeography, there has until recently been a converse gap on the question of humans. Although biogeography would in theory claim a holistic remit that includes humans as part of the Earth's biota, its unusual practice has reinforced humans as different from and separate to the rest of nature. Yes, so true, so harmful. Most biogeographers now recognize that the vegetation patterns they are studying reflect both deep time evolutionary pathways and the muddy and indecipherable blur of human influence. But an outdated view of the world as natural ecosystems with humans disturbing them remains the mainstream view. And that's not fair either, okay? Yes, have humans disturbed ecosystems? Absolutely true. But doesn't any species that come into an environment disturb the ecosystem? And not all disturbances are bad, right? Going back to our conversation on Tuesday in the Plant Inspired Masterclass on invasive species, being invasive is not always negative, right? I am an invasive species to Italy. And have I created harm to Italy? No. Have I brought more Cubanness and Americanness to the Dominhurianness that has also been introduced as kind of an invasive species? Absolutely. Is that been enriching and expanding? I think so. But then again, I'm a human, so of course I would think so. But more importantly, am I evolving with, am I stuck in my little box where I am this thing and therefore you have to adapt to me or I am going to railroad over you? No, that's not the way that I've chosen to do it. I learned Italian. I am a fluent Italian. I learn Italian cultures, and I am aware when I am interacting with both cultures. And at some point, kind of like our Dominhurianness, we are introducing a whole new culture and creating a new culture. Is the new culture in the lands that were of the Salassi and eventually of the Italians? Yes. Is it a bad thing? Good question. And that's something that we should evaluate because we are, because of the way that our land space is, it means that if I'm going to create a new culture, I have to create that new culture somewhere. So I do have to push out the existing culture in order to it. But I'm not really pushing it out, because the Italians can be Italian and Damanhurian, and I can be Cuban, and I can be American, and I can be Italian, and I can be Damanhurian. So, and that Damanhurian is the mix of all of those together. So lots of things to contemplate, but the point is that we should not always look as humans as disturbing natural ecosystems as well. There has to be ways in which the human is a part of that ecosystem, and therefore is evolving with the ecosystem. And that is where we're moving towards, where we see this as the predominant way of doing things, rather than what we have today, which is that the predominant way of doing things is by destroying, controlling, and doing exactly what I want. Paleoecological view of long-term human impacts was among the first to challenge that view. Two influential bodies of recent work have reconfigured biogeography and ecology to systematically include humans, and are particularly relevant to the discussion of invasive plants. Ellis and Ramankuti revised global biomes, a key analytical unit of conventional biogeography, to explicitly include human agency in vegetation systems. They characterize 18 anthropogenic biomes based on empirical analysis of population, land use, and land cover, and a spatial resolution of approximately 86 kilometers squared. Examples include rice villages, residential irrigated croplands, and populated forests. This is the first systematic attempt to render visible the extent to which human presence and processes have become embedded in the structures of biomes. It has been driven by the bottom-up empirical evidence of transformed Earth, albeit, as the authors acknowledge, there is still much to find in the human-plant relationships below, their smallest pixel size. Indeed, anthromes, right, anthropogenic biomes, are understood as mosaic formations that contain considerable variability. Anthropogenic loss of native species and anthropogenic introductions interact to increase, let's get through the image, species richness in many regional areas, even while global biodiversity is thinning. The second related body of work advances the concept of the novel ecosystem, a system of abiotic, biotic, and social components, right? Abiotic being something that is self-providing. So plants are abiotic. And then, wait, hold on. I just got those backwards. Well, you get it. Sorry. Blink for a second. I'm like, biotic, abiotic. So one produces food, the other one consumes. It's a consumer and a producer. Social components and their interactions that, by virtue of human influence, differ from those that prevailed historically, having a tendency to self-organize and manifest novel qualities without intensive human management. And this is what I was talking about, right? They have a tendency to self-organize and manifest novel qualities. What are novel qualities? Mutations, new things that come up unexpectedly. Here, the presence and influence of people is recognized, but within a framework characterized by uncertainty and surprise that humans do not control. That such a perspective is still considered controversial in mainstream biogeography and ecology can be seen in the vociferous debates over applying these perspectives to questions of invasive plant management. Our empirical focus in this paper on practices of engagement between plants, people, and others at very fine-grained scales draws both of these bodies of literature into the conversation. The lively capacities of plants. This is, I'm really curious as to where they're going to go with this lively capacity, but I do like this overall. This is one of the first papers that I've heard, that I've read, that really starts to bring in the conversation of how do plants have a voice in the discussion, right? How are they being applied? How do kin express themselves in this landscape, in this field, and how do they become a part of the agents or the active members of this growing field? The lively capacities of plants. In this section, we draw mainly on recent biological research to conceptualize what we call the capacities of plants. Given the diverse ways in which the concept of relationality, is understood in the literature, we emphasize 3 ways in which we see such capacities as relational. First, we do not assume humans have to be part of the relations, although they often are. Second, relationality can be intra-organism, referring to processes constituting that organism. It is not only about external relations. Third, relationality is not a synonym for dynamism and fluidity. It can congeal and solidify in forms and processes that persist over long periods of time. In the case of plants, extremely long periods of evolutionary time, which I think is another element that is extremely important here. We tend to look at many of these disciplines in terms of human time. But when we start to invoke the time of the other species that are there, whether we're talking about bacteria time or plant time or tree time, because maybe in plant time, there's many different kinds of plants, everything sort of changes differently. We need to apply all these different logics in order to best understand. And this is something for you to think about in your own life, right? We have a tendency to think that when we're discussing things with people, we're all looking at it from the same time scale, but it's actually not true. There are some people that look at things in extremely small time scales and some people that look at things in extremely long. Strategists in different organizations, or when you're planning out parts of your own life, or when you're having conversations with people about anything, even seasonal, right? We tend to look at things from different perspectives. And it's important for us to introduce time into it. If there's something plants can help us understand, is that plant time is variable. There are times when plants act and react very quickly, and there are times where plants allow something to take over because their extended lifespan, or because their lifespan is very different from our own. So just allow that to sort of seep into your concepts and the way that you look at things, because it is a very different way of experiencing the world when you start to see things from different aspects of time. Particular plant species or individuals might have additional capacities, such as rubber vine's facility to burn or to manifest in a varied form. But this conceptualization offers a sense of what plants can do, providing a basis for further exploration. These are shared capacities that constitute their liveliness and difference from other beings, and provide the basis from which we go to understand their agency and subjectivity. Distinctive materialities. Plants are considered by scientists to, usually, share a set of 5 capacities to practice or practices that distinguish them from other beings. Firstly, performing photosynthesis. Plants enacting their capacity to eat the sun is the most profound difference between plants and animals. All living organisms require carbon in one form or another for the essential life processes like growth and metabolism. And since photosynthesis is the only way to convert carbon from inorganic, non-available, to organic, available, life forms, life depends on this process that most of the time is done by plants, right? Of course, we know that there are some lichens, we know that there are algae that do it as well, but the majority of our planet who photosynthesize, plants. In carrying out photosynthesis, plants trophically underpin terrestrial, aquatic, and marine ecosystems. They also maintain stable oxygenation of the atmosphere and water availability. Over geological timescales, plants drive the carbon cycles of the planet. Photosynthesis also produces complex sugars and other compounds, allowing plants to store starch and form cellulose cell walls, abilities dependent on multicellular generation. Starch provides energy for growth, while cellulose becomes fibrous, giving structure and strength to plants. Finally, plants alternate generations in their life cycles or perform sporic meiosis during reproduction. In taxonomy, this set of 5 capacities clearly tied to material forms and relations differentiate plants from other beings. These capacities came together in evolutionary time long before humans, and consequent plant materialities have implications for human-plant relations. Plants' capacities to photosynthesize affords humans the opportunity to live and breathe, eat and thrive. Plants have affected the way our bodies evolved and continue to be fundamental to our daily bodily relations. So, have you noticed? I know I'm sort of interrupting, and I shouldn't because of the time, but I'm going to. Have you noticed how respectful this paper is? Like, we read a lot of papers together now. We've read, if you go into Sprout discussions, you will see all the papers we've read, and wow, there is a lot of papers in the naturally conscious community that we've read together now over time. And most of them, even when they're talking about plants, feel like you're kind of talking about them in the room. You know how when you're talking about somebody in the third party, and there's ways to do that is respectfully or not. There's a lot of it's thrown around, like inanimate object type of language that seeps into, and I think it's just a bias. I don't think many of the papers that we've read, I don't think they really mean to do that, but I think that they accidentally do it. But if you notice that this paper doesn't really have that feeling, like maybe it's a wishful thinking, but I feel like there's a respect here to the plants as a plant being. I don't know where we're going to go with it, and I don't know if it stays all the way through the end, but I really do enjoy the fact that the more I'm reading about this, even talking about plants, like, starch provides the energy and whatever, it's not putting it in the context of humans, first and foremost, which I think is part of this discussion and why this is important. And at the same time, there's the other side of it that feels like it's very respectful of plants, as like almost admiring plants as the individuals that they are. I don't know about you, but I get this sensation, I'd love, I get this sensation. Where I was, plants' capacity to photosynthesize affords humans. It's almost like plants do this thing, and this gives this possibility for humans to live and breathe, eat and thrive. So it's like, I like that in the top, it's the fact that plants do this for themselves so that they could eat and breathe and live and die, eat and thrive, live and breathe, eat and thrive. And they also do this in a way that affords. It's almost like I can do this for myself. So I am, to a certain extent, selfish because I'm doing it for myself, but I also do this in a way that is the other. And this is probably kind of part of that indifference conversation that we were having earlier, right? I am doing this for myself, and then I am doing this to afford others the opportunities to do it. I'm kind of indifferent to, in a good way, like I do it because this is the right thing to do, and then I also allow this to be something, an extension that helps others. Plants have affected the way our bodies evolved and continue to be blah, blah, blah. Okay, sorry. Morton argues that we are not so much embedded in the earth as in the relationship between the earth and the sun, a notion worthy of considering in efforts to decenter humans in human plant studies. We're embedded in the earth as in the relationship between the earth and the sun. Ooh, it's a powerful thing to think about. Let's put a note on that one. These materialities also pervade and help shape the capacities in the following sections. Moving without humans. As mentioned, Aristotle defined animals as those who move and plants as those who do not. Immobility continues to be a widely accepted defining criterion for plants, including in geography, except that we know that they do move. It's just a different time scale, folks. It's just a different time scale. However, Hall has shown many faults with this logic, founded mostly on failures to observe actual plants. For instance, contrasting Aristotle's practices with those of his pupil, Theophrastus, in geographic discussions in plant mobility, agency is usually attributed to people, for example, in discussion of portmanteau, I don't even know what that is, portmanteau biota, and colonial plant movements, and in the definition of native species. Our point is not to ignore the significance of human movement of plants, but rather to also consider the mobility of plants that is independent of humans, albeit relational with such things as wind, internal water pressure, and angles of the sun. Yes, plants move all on their own, not just in their motion, like day-to-day motion, but their movement as in over generations being able to move and inhabit new areas that are not always directly connected to humans. Even long distances, we have seen plants like ginkgo that have shown up in other parts of the world not because a human picked those seeds and planted them somewhere else, but because there have been other relationships with other beings, probably birds or other types of animals or who knows what, that have caused that movement. And so therefore plants are autonomous in that they have developed their own adaptations in order to be able to move without legs. We have adapted to movement being with legs, but plants have adapted movement to be these other things, and in many times and in many aspects, multi-generational. In other words, it takes generation after generation in order to move, but that still is an autonomous decision-making that the plants have invoked this relation and have called upon this relation with other beings in order to be able to do this. To see plants as immobile is to have a very partial view of what constitutes mobility. Compensating for the limits of sessile living, some parts of plants move. For example, mobility during the reproductive phase relates with the capacity of plants to alter generations during their life cycles. Protective sporopollenin enables the spores and pollens of terrestrial plants to widely disperse away from the rooted parent organism, allowing future generations to overcome potentially restrictive or difficult local conditions. Although the movements of plant parts, fruits, pollen, seeds, are widely considered to be at the mercy of other agents of dispersal, animals, wind, water, plants capitalize on the movements of others to their own advantage. I love this. This is so respective. This is such the right way of thinking about it. They're not subject to them. They are capitalizing them. They're taking advantage of it in a good way. They're working with that in order to create the ability of movement. Plants use animal mobilities for purposes of reproduction and more. When lima bean plants are attacked by herbivore spider mites, for instance, they excrete a substance that attracts predatory spider mites, which then eat the herbivores. In this move, lima bean plants act with and against spider mites to stop their own destruction. Even as they are rooted in place, plants move. Since Charles and Francis Darwin postulated that plants' movements might be due to turgescence, osmotic pressure relations as plant cells respond to environmental stimulants, changing technologies have allowed scientific knowledge of plant mobilities to become more detailed. Edwards and Moles define 3 categories of plant movements: circumnutation, which is how the plants have that circular motion as they're exploring their landscape, which is a very important part of the way that plants move. Not just things like bean plants, but most plants. Actually, I have a beautiful type of cactus that unfortunately I'm not exactly sure because I couldn't understand the species. It's a species that it's a plant that was, it's a rescue. Let's be honest, it was a rescue. I've only seen in the wild this particular type of cactus in the very south of Italy with beautiful flowers that I pray one day you will find the right conditions to be able to have those flowers here. I'm trying really hard. Anyways, this is a cactus that happens to be one very long main stem, trunk, whatever we call for a plant. Sorry, I'm not sure of your terminology. And I literally watch all day long how this plant moves in that it's fascinating to see how the plant explores the environment all day. Sorry, I get really caught on it. Okay, topic response and nastric responses. So these are circumnutation, they describe it themselves, describes the corkscrew-like radical twining motion of the growing tips of plants, which all plants do, although at different rates and for various lifespans. The questioning and grasping movements of pea tendrils, for example, are well known and easily observed. Response movements, whether tropic or nastric, can be rapid or gradual, rhythmic or irregular. In tropic responses, sensing plants move towards potentially beneficial and away from potentially pragmatic encounters with light, gravity, structures, or water. The mimosa plant, which quickly collapses its leaves when it is disturbed, is known for this kind of response. In contrast, nastric responses occur when plants react in a non-directional way. Examples of this kind of plant mobility include the folding in of leaves at night as part of spleet movements, or the rhythmic opening and closing of guard cells around stomatal pores in leaves. Stomata, as you know, is you have a leaf, under part of the leaves, you have all these little tiny stomata that are like little, they look like little mouths, to be honest. And the stomata is how the plant breathes and how transpiration occurs between water and pressure and things. And so it's really beautiful. I just realized the time. Hold on, I want to see. We are on page 6 of this paper. And this paper is long. We are only on page 6, and this paper goes down to page 13. So we have a doubling of this paper. So given that, I'm thinking we might be at a stopping point. Let me just read. Where are we? And see if this is a good stopping point, or if we go a little tiny bit. Okay, I'm going to try to get to living without the rubber vine in Northern Australia, if that's okay for all of you, because I think it'll give us a nice closing point. I'll try not to be so verbose. All right, sensing and communicating. The facilitation of the above kinds of movements depends on plants sensing and communicating. Internally, plants communicate through assemblages of proteins, minerals, and chemicals, carrying complex signals to various cells and tissues. Over time, through such processes, learning and memory may develop. The Venus flytrap, for example, can be said to have sensory memory similar to animals in the ability to detect, react, and to trap its prey. The rapid closing of leaves or trap occurs when at least 2 sensor hairs respond to stimulus and chemicals are released, signaling specified leaves to close. Because of course, if they did it every time they were touched, then kin would really be tired at the end of the day. Debates about chemical signaling challenge our ideas about passivity by suggesting that plants perceive, process, and react to environmental information. Duh. In part, plant responses are considered passive rather than active because human lifetimes provide the referential framework. This is what I was saying before, right? When we look at things in human times, of course, it looks passive. But when you extend it out to, and you think about the lifespan of the actual plant that you're working with or that you're interacting with or that you're studying, then things change. At human timescales, the multiple dimensions of plant agency are obscured, both more intimate and more abstract than with any animal. If, however, plants are considered within their own lifetimes and scales, their responses become active in sometimes quite sophisticated ways rather than passive. Trowavas has argued specifically for plant intelligence to be recognized, referencing plants' many reproductive, adaptive, communicative, planning, and predictive capacities. This debate is significant for showing how botanists are currently thinking about plant lives. Remember, I was talking about the timeline at the very beginning, how important this timeline is. Trowavas' papers start in 2002, 2005. This is about 10 years later, and we're still we're still in the middle of this discussion still, but it's starting to become much more acceptable and understandable, at least the part around intelligence. This debate is significant for showing how botanists are currently thinking about plant lives and provides productive connection to social science efforts to recognize nature's active voice. The concept of intelligence has such a strong connection to human-centered concepts of mind and consciousness that it is hard to attribute it to yet other beings without resorting to human yardstick. We note 2 ways in which plants may stimulate further thought in this area. First, intelligence is arguably an essential characteristic rather than a relational one. Yes. In our relational analysis capacities, we are trying to attend to what plants do rather than what they are, intelligent or not. Second, the disagreement between Trowavas and Fern is partly, and we've gone over these papers, by the way. If you go back through our archive, in Sprout discussions, the program/replays, you will see me going through a lot of these papers with Trowavas, Fern, and these. It's partly over whether plants are individuals, with Fern arguing that plants cannot be intelligent because they are not individuals. Look at this face. Look at this face. Look at how I think about that. Animals, again, provide the reference for what it means to be an individual. Plants, however, challenge the sense of individuality, as we now discuss. Flexible bodies. The fact that plants take many different, fascinating, and sometimes seemingly bizarre forms is a staple of natural history books and documentaries. Here, we are concerned not so much with the differences of form, but with what this allows us to infer about the plant self or individual. The way in which understanding of body is bound up in the understanding the self has been extensively discussed in feminist analysis And a number of authors have extended this thinking to the non-human body. Darn it. Why do I have a feeling I have to go read more papers? We've only done a few ecofeminist papers here. They're in there. We've done them. They've been fascinating to do. I think we need to talk about this a little bit more. Okay, I'll prepare. Plants confront understandings of the body that use the human or even animal body as a reference point. Plant identity, ooh, this is another, oh my God. Sorry, I'm about to make bad jokes, so I'm not going to make them because I love it. I love this expansion of thoughts and this way of looking at things. I'm just loving it. Plant identity stretches across what Rayner calls dynamic boundaries. These boundaries include those between self and non-self, fixture and indeterminacy, and individual and collective form. Growth in animals constitutes the enlargement of juveniles, leading to a relatively clear delineation of bodily self. For plants, however, growth involves reconfiguration of cell confederations. These dynamic boundaries of plants often lead to uncertainty in human engagements with plants. For example, discomfort in a London garden or indecision in an invasive species eradication. Oh my God, I want to say so much about this. I want to say so much about this. To summarize then, because this is trying to put my thoughts together in a synthetic form for right now, and because I feel like we could open another rabbit hole here, which is so fascinating when we start to think about the self. And I can go in many different directions. I can go about the self from the human self as it is today, when instead we're talking about, for example, conjoined twins. And today we think about conjoined twins always with the idea of separation. But there have been conjoined twins that have lived out the rest of their natural lives in that natural state. And what is individuality in that particular instance, right? And we don't question the individuality in that case, because we could have a conversation and see that there are distinct personalities. But what does that mean for the plant body, and how can that help us better understand other aspects of ourselves? And then individuality moving on into so many different cultural and social references that we can also look into. I am not diving into that rabbit hole, but know that another seed has been planted. We have very fertile ground here in the naturally conscious community. Like, NCC is filled with fertile ground, and all of our sprouts are sprouting up in different directions, and we love that, and we want that to continue to happen. So I'm going to stop right there, but know that I'm with you. To summarize then, our argument is not only that plants have agency, a point well made by others, and subjectivity, a more controversial proposition, but also that focusing on plant worlds shows how human-centered our conceptualizations of agency and subjectivity have been. Thinking more broadly about alternative modes of mobility, communication, and individual self, as expressed in plants, challenges us to open up those larger concepts. These movements, senses, and flexibilities come together to give a come together to give a general sense of what it means to live as a plant. But though these are mostly shared by plants, each species, even each plant, has its own dynamic manifestations of form and relations with humans and otherwise. Engaging with different categories of plants, trees, wheat, seeds, food, gives researchers different insights. In the following case, our focus falls on the rubber vine. Okay, we're going to stop here. We're going to stop here. I'll be honest, I kind of don't want to stop here, but we are going to stop here because I want to get into the rubber vine story because it is kind of going to touch the whole invasiveness much more. This was really just setting the stage for this entire discussion. And so I'm loving it. I'm loving it. I do wish sometimes, I have to say that there's a part of me that wants to just kind of plow through. And we might have some sessions where I'll book myself with some time. I'm going to look at papers a little bit more. And when I know that the papers are longer, I might just book us out for 2 hours. You know, there's always going to be the replay, so don't worry about it. You can always watch in chunks, watch however it feels. But I feel like having to hold on to this conversation for another week is going to be just so challenging because there's so much goodness and so much interestingness in here. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what we've read so far. Again, this is all setting the stage for the invasive conversation that we're going to have with rubber vine as the example. So this has been kind of looking at us and expanding our view and our understanding of what we think of as plants. And I'm very much appreciating the researchers' way of looking at this conversation and of saying, look, we've been looking at this kind of, I don't want to say all wrong, but very limited in scope. And even though it sounds like there is a desire to respect plants for who plants are, we're still not giving them exactly the just understanding. We're not really stepping into their plantness, and therefore I'm going to take this into the next step, which is that therefore we're not stepping into our own plantness. So I think this is going to challenge a lot of the ways that we see ourselves. And I feel like this is going to give us, and let me be really clear here. When I go through all this and I talk about being our plantless, this does not mean that I have to embrace every aspect of being plants. This means what I am hoping that all of us understand, and those of you that work one-on-one with me know that I go into this a lot, and I kind of, use this mirror as we're having our discussions and through our coaching and through our mentorship to really expand the way we look at ourselves, is that this gives us more possibilities. Plants are one form of species. And when we start to see that we have a plantness, we have a whole range of other capacities from which we can pull from. Did we pull from all of them in this incarnation? No. We pulled some, but the thing is, are we giving ourselves permission to recognize that our individuality as a human is much broader than the very narrow definitions that society has given us right now? And so working one-on-one, for example, we're able to get into your specific sense of self and sense of expression of self, right? To figure out what are the capacities that you're pulling from in this lifetime, and then look at how those come together and are able to then be expressed through the actions that you take, so that you are really creating actions in flow with your true nature rather than trying to narrowly fit them. Now, that doesn't mean that we are not going to have to sometimes create filters and bridges that step into what society has currently defined. But there's a very big difference from me knowing who I am and me looking at ways to not modify who I am, but express who I am through certain lenses that exist right now, as I'm constantly pushing those to expand. And there's another thing for me to hide, or for me to feel like I have to become something that I'm not. And so really the process of working, one-on-one, or the process that I want all sprouts here to be able to experience, is that always further embodying your true, complete, true nature, your true self, your full expanded self. And then from a conscious place, choosing how to use that, when to adapt, when to expand, when to push, when to step away, and all these different aspects of living in this life as the most complete version of you. Because only in this way, is my belief, can you really achieve your true life purpose. And your life purpose is so freaking important. So need you to achieve that life purpose. And so want to create that place. So this is why for me, it becomes such an urgent piece. It's so important, why it's something that I'm talking about in so many different aspects. I want you to know that this is the direction that you can go. But to go in this direction, you've got to take that first step of recognizing, okay, wait a minute, I am more, I am different, I am weird, and I have all these different places. But I don't know what to do with any of this. And people are calling me spacey or kooky, or I don't seem to fit in a mold. And so stepping out into that and saying, I want to work with somebody, or I want to work on this, I want to create, I want to embody this, is really the first step. But I'm going to stop here because we've gone over time, but it's for a good cause. Thank you so much for sticking with this. If you're part of the replay crew and you're watching, you're part of those that are watching in the replay. Thank you so much for being here. Totally loving it. Please leave your comments. Let me know what your thoughts are. We will be doing part 2 next week, and I am excited to see how rubber vine fits into all of this. But until then, remember to always, always resist the urge to hold back your evolving green brilliance. I'm here, Tigria Gardenia. I am so excited to have you with us, and I am looking forward to the next time we chat. Until then, bye.